Hey, good morning everybody. At least it's morning for me. I'm here at another hotel room and I got a good night's sleep last night. It was pretty quiet. Which has really been the exception rather than the rule during my 30-state cross-country road trip here in the US that took me 35 days and 9,000 miles to complete. The most expensive part of the trip was the hotel rooms, and along the way I stayed in some pretty amazing hotels, but almost as many awful hotels. A couple even felt pretty dangerous to stay in, and they weren't necessarily the lowest priced hotels. So especially for those of you who like to travel, I thought I would share with you what I thought were the best and the worst hotels that I stayed in during my trip. And the biggest surprise for me is that some of the most expensive hotels turned out to be the worst, and some of the least expensive turned out to be the best. The Hampton Inn in Concord, New Hampshire was the most expensive hotel I stayed in on this trip, and it turned out to be one of the best, but also one of the worst hotel experiences of my trip. The rate for the night, including taxes, was $152, and that included my AAA discount. I only stayed here because I wasn't able to find any other hotels in the area that were any more affordable, and it was getting very late in the day, and in the direction I was headed, the next town was at least an hour to an hour and a half away. So I just decided to bite the bullet and spend the night here, even though it was above my target $100 per night hotel budget. The hotel itself was luxurious and almost like a 5-star resort. It was beautiful and comfortable, and definitely the nicest hotel I stayed in, but unfortunately it had some of the most inconsiderate and loudest guests of any of the hotels where I spent the night. They were yelling and laughing and partying in the hallways the entire night, and I didn't get any sleep at all. And since the front desk was just a few doors down, I could also hear their phone ringing non-stop for most of the night. I left the next morning feeling very exhausted and not having had any sleep at all, but they did have a very nice hot breakfast that I would compare to any Denny's or IHOP, and it was one of the very few hotels that I stayed in that even offered a hot breakfast or any breakfast at all. Most of the hotels in the $100 and below price range no longer offer anything for breakfast. A few offered cold cereal or a muffin, and once or twice I was able to get a piece of fruit, but that was about it. I think the takeaway here is that even in the nicest hotels, you can still end up not getting any sleep. On the other hand, and a bit ironically, I had one of my best night's sleep at one of the least expensive hotels on my trip. And this wasn't a fluke. Some of the most affordable hotels were also some of the quietest and most comfortable. I just checked into the Days Inn here. It was $65, all taxes included. I got the AAA discount, or maybe it was the AARP discount, one of the discounts. And it's not bad, and I think it's going to be a lot quieter than last night. It seems to be on a much quieter street. It's a much smaller town. It's Greenville, Tennessee, and the pillows don't look soiled like the ones last night. So, it does have a microwave and a little mini fridge. Yeah, it looks pretty nice. It's not exactly Super 8 or Quality Inn, but a huge step up from America's Best Value, where I stayed last night. So when I considered the price and the quality and the ability to get a good night's sleep, this Days Inn in Greenville, Tennessee was probably the best. At the end of this video, I'll tell you what my favorite hotel room was, though, and why. And also which of the chain hotels turned out to be my favorite overall. When I was growing up, my mom used to always say, if you can't say something nice about someone, then don't say anything at all. So I'm not intentionally trying to say anything bad about any of the hotels or hotel rooms where I stayed. I just thought it might be helpful to some of you who travel, and maybe to some of the hotels as well, if I shared my personal favorites and least favorite hotels from my recent road trip. Just keep in mind though, your experience might be completely different than mine, even in the same hotel and maybe even in the same room. And if you have stayed in any of the hotels that I'm mentioning, feel free to share your experiences as well, especially if your experience was different than mine. About a half a dozen of the hotels where I stayed were pretty awful and sometimes kind of gross. Some were very old and dirty and run down, and all of the hotels I stayed in were pretty noisy. But pretty much all of the hotel rooms that are at the bottom of my list are either there because they were extremely noisy and I wasn't able to sleep at all throughout the night, or I felt very unsafe staying there. And these were usually things that were out of the control of the hotel and were just all about the other guests. In the hotel where I stayed in Montgomery, Alabama, there was a very intimidating guy loitering, walking back and forth in front of my hotel room. As I was unloading the items from my car and bringing them into the room, he was asking me for cigarettes and money and just wouldn't leave. And the hotel did have a security person who did his best to get the guy to leave, but the guy just kept coming back. And surprisingly, a similar thing happened to me at 2 other hotels on this trip. And these weren't the cheapest hotels. Some of them were over $100 a night. But of all the bad hotel experiences I had on this trip, I think this was probably the worst. This America's Best Value Inn is located in a suburb of Nashville, not far from President Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and I happened to arrive a couple of hours before check-in time, but this is where I needed to spend the night because I was planning to go to the Hermitage the next day. I stopped first at the Comfort Inn across the street, but their rates were about $150 for the night, plus they said there would be an additional $40 or $50 surcharge if I wanted to check in an hour early. From the outside and from across the street, the America's Best Value Inn looked pretty nice, so I decided to drive across the street and check out their rates. Their room rate for the night was only $75, and they had a room available so I didn't have to wait an hour or two to check in. I asked for a non-smoking room, and the sign on the door said it was a non-smoking room, but as soon as I walked in, it just reeked of cigarette smoke. In hindsight, I should have just immediately gone back to the lobby and asked for a different room or checked out altogether. But I wasn't able to find any other hotels nearby, so I figured it would just be one night, and how bad could it be? Well, it didn't really take that long to find out. Not only was the room really smoky, but also very, very dirty and very old, very run down, and one of the loudest rooms I've been in because of the very busy street and the freeway just outside the door. The pillowcases, as you can see, look yellow and greasy, and there's burn hole marks in the bedspread. And is that a grease stain on the headboard, or was there a fire? It's hard to tell. Why I stayed even 5 minutes in this room, I have no idea. I would have gotten a better night's sleep sleeping in my car. From a distance, the hotel looked relatively new, but up close, it turned out to be very, very old, and there were huge gaps around the door that let in all the noise, and also seemed to suck in all of the cigarette smoke from all of the guests who seemed to really like hanging out on the balcony smoking cigarettes all afternoon and all evening. On the plus side, at least at this hotel, I didn't have to listen to any screaming babies or barking dogs. Most of the hotels now, at least in this price range, to make it even more difficult for travelers to get a good night's sleep, they allow dogs. Which reminds me that on the very first night of this road trip, I spent the night in Phoenix, Arizona, at a Motel 6, and I had the misfortune of being given a double room with a locked door in between the 2 rooms, but the walls were paper thin, and the family next door checked in with what sounded like an entire room full of kids, plus a newborn baby, and 2 vicious dogs. The dogs spent most of the night fighting and trying to kill each other, while the baby screamed the entire night, and once again, I didn't even get a minute of sleep. The room was also extremely noisy, but at least it wasn't also full of smoke. I'll definitely never forget the nights I spent in these 2 hotel rooms, but not for the right reasons. On this road trip, I stayed in quite a few national chain hotels, including America's Best Value Inn, Comfort Inn, Days Inn, Extended Stay America, Econolodge, Hampton Inn, Red Roof Inn, Super 8, and Quality Inn. And in El Paso, I stayed at the Desert Inn, which I thought was a Days Inn. I've been reluctant over the years to stay in non-chain hotels, but the non-chain Desert Inn turned out to be one of the nicest hotels on this trip, and also one of the most affordable, so maybe I need to rethink my hotel strategy. I only stayed in a few Quality Inns, but they were all very nice. I also stayed in quite a few Days Inn, and they were also pretty nice, but my favorite hotel is still Super 8. For the price and the quality and the locations, for the most part, they tended to be my favorites, and I stayed in more of them than any of the other hotels. But there were a couple of lemons, and this was one of them. This one is not the nicest, and it's the most expensive. I mean, look at this. I've never seen anything like this at a Super 8. At a Motel 6, yes. But this is an older hotel. Most of the Super 8s I've stayed in have almost all, in fact, I think they've all been new or really, really new. This one's really, really old, and I mean, it's not so bad inside. It smells okay. Doesn't smell like smoke, and there's no microwave. That's what I would find in a Motel 6, no microwave. And the saddest part is that this is the most expensive, one of the most expensive hotels I've stayed in on my trip so far. And this isn't a large city like New York or Chicago. It's a small town called Stevensville in Michigan. The other disappointing and surprising thing that I've discovered on this trip is that almost none of the hotels, at least in this price range, offer AAA discounts or AARP discounts like they used to do. Most of them, like this one here today, just say, sorry, no discounts at all. Take it or leave it. And as I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, on my 2019 cross-country road trip, staying in the same type of hotels, the rates averaged around $75 per night. They're now averaging around $100 per night, and most of them are not accepting discounts, and most of them have stopped including any kind of real breakfast, other than maybe coffee and maybe a muffin. On the plus side, nearly every single hotel, except for the one I mentioned in Nashville, Tennessee, had lots of really, really comfortable pillows to choose from. And their beds were all really, really comfortable. So at the handful of hotels that didn't have screaming babies or barking dogs, incredibly loud traffic noises, or partying guests next door or up above, I was able to sleep sometimes better than I sleep at home. But that was definitely the exception rather than the rule. The least expensive hotel I stayed in on this trip was this Days Inn in College Station, Texas, and it was pretty much what you would expect for $58 a night. Unfortunately, I lost all the film footage except for this one photo that I snapped on my way out the next morning. If I had to choose just one hotel room on this trip as my favorite, based on the price and the quality, I guess it would have to be the Desert Inn in El Paso, Texas. It was only $70.50 for the night, and that included all taxes, and it was one of the largest, cleanest, and most comfortable rooms that I stayed in. It was also pretty quiet and seemed very safe. And I have to say I'm very surprised because this is the only hotel that was not part of a national chain. As I mentioned earlier, I definitely was not expecting that. In fact, I was expecting just the opposite. This week I want to give a shout out and a very big thank you to Alana, Lori Stone, and Alana Rian. I sure hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you all so much for your very kind and very generous donations to my channel using YouTube's Super Thanks. They really mean a lot and are very appreciated. I hope this review of my hotel rooms will be helpful to some of you. And if you have your own hotel reviews that you'd like to share with us, please do so in the comments section below. I would love to hear about your best and worst hotel experiences. And until next time, thanks for sharing the memories, everybody.